What's the one thing you'd say to your younger self before your first betrayal?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Do you know your true worth? Yesterday, my parents told me they could not make it to my ceremony. An hour later, my sister posted boomerangs from a brunch 2 miles away. I did not argue, I did not call, I did not cry. I made a list. That list began years ago, long before the morning of that message. I had been carrying the weight of every expense for my education and training, taking extra shifts, juggling 2 jobs, and borrowing money with interest that I alone repaid. I remember driving home at dawn after a night shift, only to sit through an exam half asleep, telling myself that if I just kept going I would eventually have a credential that no one could take away from me. My parents were always polite about it, telling me how proud they were, but somehow their real energy and money kept flowing toward my sister Jenna's weddings, showers, and endless parties. I learned not to expect much, just to smile when they called me the independent one and told me how great it was that I never needed much help. So when the day of my ceremony came, I already knew not to expect balloons or flowers or some teary speech. Still, I thought they would be there, because I had sent the invites months in advance and reserved 2 VIP seats with their names printed. I kept telling myself, even if they had failed me in the past, today might be different. That hope lasted until I checked my phone that morning and saw Mom's text, "Lauren, we cannot make it, so sorry, logistics are too messy." 10 minutes later, Dad added a thumbs-up emoji, as if that sealed it with approval. The old sting hit me, the one that makes your chest go heavy, but I answered with only one line, "Thanks for letting me know." I refused to give them another ounce of my energy. When I arrived at the ceremony check-in, the coordinator asked for the names of the 2 guests to be printed in the official program. I paused for maybe 2 seconds, then gave her new names: Tasha, my friend from night shifts, and Mr. Alvarez, the supervisor who had once swapped a 12-hour shift so I could take my exam. These were the people who had carried me when no one else did. I felt a strange sense of relief as I crossed out my parents' names on the acknowledgement sheet and replaced them with theirs. The coordinator nodded and said, "Good choice." The program had a space where I was supposed to thank my parents. I took out the revised line I had typed on my phone that morning after reading their message. It simply said, "I want to thank the people who actually showed up." No dramatic wording, no drawn-out explanation, just plain honesty. I handed it over. I knew this was not the kind of revenge people imagine when they picture screaming confrontations or public call-outs. This was quieter, sharper, more precise. I was not begging anyone to change, I was editing the story to match reality. As I walked through the rehearsal, practicing the steps I had dreamed about for years, my phone buzzed with another notification. I glanced down and caught the preview of a post before the screen locked. Jenna, sitting at a crowded brunch table, laughing with friends, captioned, "Family first." The timestamp overlapped perfectly with the slot reserved for my ceremony. For a moment I stood there with the phone in my hand, not angry, not surprised, just tired of pretending any of it was accidental. I locked the screen and slid it into my bag. What people did not see in that moment was the calculation happening in my head. I realized that every time they dismissed me or downplayed what I was doing, I had accepted it in silence, telling myself that arguing would not change them. But silence was not working. Silence had turned me into the backup character in my own life. That morning I promised myself I would not stay silent anymore. I would choose exactly where my energy went, and I would choose exactly who I credited. By the time the rehearsal ended, I had a plan. My parents would not be there to clap. My sister would not stop timing her posts to compete with mine. But the people who actually stood by me deserved to be lifted, and I was going to do it without apology. When I handed in the revised program, I felt like I was finally taking myself off mute. I did not have to yell. I just had to replace their names with the ones that mattered. And yet, even as I tried to focus on the ceremony ahead, that glimpse of Jenna's brunch photo would not leave my mind. I could already imagine the comments piling up, the captions about celebrating family, while my name was missing. My stomach twisted, not because I needed them to be proud, but because I knew how this would play out publicly. The narrative would be hers again, curated to make her look radiant while my milestone looked invisible. I kept thinking, do I let it go, or do I finally flip the story? I walked out of the hall and stood in the courtyard, looking at the stage where tomorrow I would hear my name announced. The air felt thick, but I did not cry. I thought back to every time I had told myself to swallow the anger, to stay quiet, to be the easy one. And right then I knew I had no interest in being easy anymore. I turned off my phone completely, slipped it into my bag, and walked toward my car. I had one day left to decide how far I was willing to go, and for the first time, I was leaning toward not holding back at all. When the morning finally slid into the kind of afternoon that feels like a test of who you are willing to be when nobody is clapping, I told myself that if I could get through the next few hours without explaining myself to anyone, then I would be fine. And if I could not, then at least I would learn something about what I still had to unlearn about our family and the way we turn inconvenience into policy and neglect into tradition. At check-in, the coordinator handed me my badge and the little envelope with the reception ticket, and while she described the order of the processional and the time I should gather with my row, my phone lit up with that familiar glow that usually means nothing and therefore always manages to interrupt everything. One glance at the preview told me Jenna had already begun her parade. Because there she was in a looping clip, clinking glasses against a plate crowded with garnishes, tagged at a trendy spot a short ride away, smiling with that polished ease that says the world is a stage and she owns the lighting, while her caption declared something about chosen family and being there for each other in big moments, which I read twice just to confirm the audacity before I locked the screen and slid the phone face down. I had promised myself I would not get pulled into commentary wars or back-channel negotiations, so instead I focused on the one move I had planned the night before when it occurred to me that I did not actually have to debate anyone to correct the record. All I had to do was post the truth plainly and walk away, and let the timestamps do the part one was tired of doing, which was arguing with people who prefer a flattering version of reality. So, 5 minutes before the processional, while my row practiced the turn and the step, I scheduled a quiet post that I had drafted like a statement to myself rather than a weapon. A simple split image I had made with the ceremony email on the left showing the start time and venue, and the brunch invite Jenna had sent to the family thread on the right with the exact window she had suggested, and beneath it a line that said, with no names and no barbs, that some people show up and some people show off, and that I was done confusing one for the other. I did not tag, I did not accuse, I did not mention a name, because anyone who needed to understand would understand, and everyone else could keep scrolling. When the music started and the procession began to snake forward in that dignified shuffle that makes you a little proud and a little nauseous, I felt my shoulders loosen, because I had finally done something I had never done before, which was choose my own narrative without asking permission from the people who always said they were on my side while they rearranged the furniture so that I never had the best seat. I walked, I smiled, I studied my breath, and I noticed that the people who had actually covered shifts and driven me to tests had taken the VIP spots I reassigned that morning and were watching me with the kind of attention that feels like a hand at your back telling you to take one more step. By the time I reached the green room where we waited between the walk and the group photo, my phone had turned into a small volcano of missed calls and stacked notifications. Because Antonice had apparently left a comment with one of her archive screenshots and a pointed memory about how dates and times are not subjective, and my mother had dialed me twice and then a third time, and finally left a voicemail that began with a tremble about being embarrassed and ended with a threat about consequences and family reputation, which I listened to once and then saved without responding because I could hear that familiar plea for me to clean up a mess I did not make, and I was not available for that job anymore. In the reception hall, a small open mic sat near the stage where we were encouraged to offer a line of thanks if we wanted, and I watched a few people speak from the heart about bosses who gave them a chance and partners who kept coffee warm on long nights. And I felt that itch to either keep my head down and slide quietly through a moment that had my name on it, or step into it with the kind of clarity that refuses to perform gratitude for people who treat presents like a hobby. I chose the second option, because I had already started rewriting the day, and there is no reason to start a renovation if you are going to leave the load-bearing walls of denial intact. When my turn came, I kept my eyes on the room, not on my phone and not on the people who were not there, and I thanked Tasha and Mr. Alvarez and the neighbor who watched my dog during exam week, and then I said the line that had been sitting in my throat for weeks, that this achievement was for those who never thought I could do it, and I let the sentence hang in the air just long enough for the meaning to land without me having to underline it, because if there is one skill I have earned the hard way, it is learning to stop adding footnotes to the truth so that fragile people can stomach it. After I stepped down, Marcus from the sponsoring company found me with that measured nod that people in charge have when they have decided you are worth their time, and he told me the remark was clear and grounded, and he asked about my work schedule and my plans. And as we spoke, I remembered how many times Jenna had pressed me to introduce her to him because she believed that access is a currency I should spend on her, even when she treats my life like a side project that needs to be rescheduled whenever her brand requires a new photo, and I felt something settle inside me as I watched Tasha approach with a soft smile that said she would wait if I needed a minute, but would also leave me alone if I needed silence. I waved her in and introduced them. And I did it without apology, because this is how you start telling the truth with your actions instead of your captions. My phone buzzed again with a message from Jenna full of accusations about humiliation and betrayal, and the claim that I was jeopardizing the family narrative. And I looked at her words and then at the looped video from Brunch, still gathering hearts from the same friends who comment on everything, and I decided that for the rest of the night the only voice that would matter would be the one I had just used into the microphone. The one that does not shake when it names exactly what happened and refuses to apologize for saying it out loud, and I slid the phone back into my bag and let the room stay quiet around me, because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is refuse to pick up a conversation that was never about you in the first place. By the time the reception found its rhythm and the first round of congratulations began to blur into the next, I understood that the day had quietly shifted from proving something to anyone into deciding who would have a seat at the table where my future is negotiated. Which sounds dramatic until you realize that most of the doors that stay shut do so not because you lack talent or discipline, but because you keep handing the handle to people who like the view through the keyhole more than they like seeing you inside, and I was determined not to make that mistake again. The small open microphone near the stage had been pitched as a chance to say thank you to whoever made survival possible, and as I stood behind two other graduates talking about mentors who took chances on them and roommates who made rent work when overtime fell through, I felt the familiar pull to soften my words so that no one would have to hold their breath, yet I also felt the new weight of the promise I made to myself this morning when I removed my parents' names from the program, which was that if a truth needed to be said in order for me to move forward, then I would say it without theatrical anger and without apologizing for the shape of the facts. When my turn arrived, I stepped up with the kind of calm that does not come from courage so much as exhaustion with pretending, and I thanked the people who had carried me in ways that were measurable and real, naming the supervisor who moved a 12-hour shift so that I could take a critical exam, and the neighbor who kept my dog safe on the days when the city felt like a treadmill, and Tasha who learned my schedule better than I learned it myself and who asked for nothing except that I show up. For my own life, then, because I had planned this sentence for weeks and had rehearsed it until the words felt like muscle memory, I added that this achievement was for those who never thought I could do it. And I let the statement sit there without any hint of accusation or humor, because sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is allow a room to experience a silence that tells the truth more efficiently than a paragraph of rationalizations. I stepped down to a low buzz of recognition that did not need to be explained, and I was walking toward the edge of the room when Marcus, the director from the sponsoring company whose decisions shape hiring lists and referral calls, approached with that unhurried look people wear when they have already decided the conversation is worth their time, and he told me the line landed because it was clean and unadorned, then asked how I balance night shifts, study blocks, and the practicum schedule. And while I answered with the plain math of hours traded, favors called in, and debts repaid, I felt the ghost of my sister's constant requests drifting through the exchange. All the little messages that piled up over the past year asking me to introduce her to him because she believed access was a household utility that should always flow toward her outlets. And for a flicker of a second I saw the old version of myself who would have agreed to carry her across this bridge and then stood on the bank waiting for a thank you that would never come. Instead, I watched Tasha hover at a respectful distance with that half smile she uses to say she will stand guard or disappear depending on what I need. And I waved her over and made the introduction that had been promised in my head to whoever showed up in real life, not to whoever treated my milestones like a staging area for her brand. I presented the person who sat in a seat my parents forfeited, who covered breaks, who checked my practice tests without keeping score, and I said out loud that she was talented and disciplined and ready to work, and I caught the quick flash of approval in Marcus's eyes that said he trusts people who understand the difference between performance and contribution. They scheduled a call for later in the week. He handed over a card, and I felt something realign inside me, like a spine that finally remembers how to hold the weight it was built for rather than the weight it was assigned. My phone pulsed in my bag with that relentless insistence that almost always means drama disguised as urgency, and when I finally looked I found a message from Jenna long enough to require scrolling. A blended drink of accusation and guilt that claimed I had humiliated the family and stolen an opportunity that was obviously hers, because that is how things have always been sorted, followed by a dare to meet her somewhere private so she could, in her own words, tell the real story before I embarrass myself further. I read it twice without reacting, because I've learned that words typed while basking in attention are usually written for an audience, not for understanding. And then I opened the social app to check whether my scheduled post had done what I intended, which was to let the timeline speak for itself without me pointing a finger. The split image was there, sitting without heat, drawing more quiet saves than loud comments, which is always the sign that people know exactly what they are looking at even if they would rather not say it out loud. Underneath it, Aunt Denise had left one line about how the group chat archives remain undefeated and that receipts are kindness for people who forget easily, which made me smile in that dry way you do when someone tells the truth without asking for applause. A few messages down, my mother had tried to frame the day as a tragic misunderstanding that could be repaired if I simply deleted the post and apologized for any confusion, to which I had no intention of responding. Because deleting the truth is how you volunteer to repeat history, and I was finished donating my piece to traditions that only exist to make other people comfortable. I went back to the reception floor where Tasha stood with a small glass of something fizzy she knew I would barely sip, and I told her that the introduction felt like releasing a held breath, and she said she noticed. And then she asked if I was ready for the storm that usually follows a clear statement, and for once I did not feel dread, because I knew I had not thrown a punch. I had simply refused to hold their coats while they posed. I could already sense the shape of the next move forming, not a spectacle, not a public teardown, but a careful, documented closing of loops that had been left open for years under the heading of family logistics. And as I started gathering what I would need to do that properly, my screen lit again with Jenna's final warning that she would go public with the real version unless I fixed this immediately. I locked the phone, slid it into my bag, and decided that if she wanted a story, I would give her one that could stand on its own feet, and I would do it with the same rule I applied on the stage, which is that truth without theatrics has a way of echoing even in rooms that are determined not to listen. When the applause of the reception began to dissolve into that restless chatter that always follows an event where everyone wants to be photographed standing close to achievement without carrying the weight of it, I felt the decision settle in me that it was no longer enough to hint or imply or craft subtle captions, because people who thrive on controlling narratives always treat subtlety like an invitation to rewrite the parts that do not flatter them. And I was finished allowing my life to be edited down to background details in service of my sister's spotlight or my parents' image management. I sat down at a quiet corner table with my phone, opened the family email thread that had been collecting dust for months, and wrote a message that was neither angry nor dramatic, but structured like a closing statement. Because if there is one thing I have learned, it is that clarity does not need adjectives when the receipts are already in order. The subject line I typed was "Thank you cards and addresses," which made it look like another administrative note rather than a grenade, and in the body I wrote that several people had asked why my parents could not attend my ceremony. So to keep everything transparent, I was attaching the message I received from them that morning, the one that cited logistics as the reason they would be absent, along with the photos Jenna had posted from brunch at the exact hour my row was walking to the stage. I explained that if I had misunderstood something, they could let me know, but until then I considered this the complete version of events. I attached the screenshots with timestamps, careful not to crop or highlight, because the power of truth lies in its plainness. Then, almost as an afterthought, but really as the most important footnote of all, I attached an older email I had saved where my mother explained that my college fund would be temporarily reallocated to cover Jenna's destination. Wedding expenses, a loan I had been told would be returned, but which never was. Beneath that I added my own scanned receipt showing the repayment of the emergency money they had lent me last winter, with a simple line, "We are square." When I pressed send, the relief was not explosive or euphoric, but steady, like air finally moving through a room that had been sealed too long. Within minutes the replies began to arrive, most of them silent in the way silence screams louder than words, except for Aunt Denise, who replied with a single word, "Noted," which, coming from her, was equivalent to an official verdict. Then something I did not expect happened. The host of Jenna's brunch, a woman I barely know but who had been tagged in the photos, commented publicly on Jenna's post that they had not known the timing and were sorry for the conflict it caused. A statement that pierced Jenna's curated image far deeper than anything I could have written, because it came from outside the family and therefore could not be dismissed as bitterness or rivalry. When my mother called again, her voice sharp with indignation, she accused me of airing private matters and humiliating them, insisting that family issues are to be handled privately and that I had crossed a line by dragging others into our internal logistics, as she put it. I listened without interrupting, and when she finally demanded to know why I thought this was necessary, I answered with one sentence that I had been practicing in my head for months. Truth is not gossip. The silence on the other end was thick enough to taste, and after a moment she hung up, which told me everything I needed to know about how much she valued appearance over accountability. As I sat there, I scrolled through my notifications and saw something even more striking than the brunch host's comment. Jenna's boss, who follows me but rarely engages with anything, had liked the split-screen post from the previous day, the one that showed the ceremony schedule beside the brunch invite. It was a small digital gesture, but it carried the unmistakable weight of recognition that someone outside our bubble could see the pattern and connect the dots, and 2 minutes later Jenna messaged me in full panic, telling me I was ruining her life. That people at work were whispering, and that I needed to fix it immediately if I wanted any chance of maintaining peace in the family. I typed a reply 3 different times, each version softer than the last, before deleting them all and placing the phone face down, because I realized that no matter how carefully I phrased it, she would hear only betrayal, and sometimes the best response is none at all. For the rest of the evening, I replayed in my mind how many years I had carried the family's version of events like unpaid rent, how often I had been told to be patient, to let things slide, to wait my turn. As though love and recognition were ration goods that would eventually trickle down to me once Jenna's needs had been fully funded. And as I thought about the cold neatness of the receipts I had just shared, I felt the quiet justice of finally refusing to co-sign their story. It was not revenge in the sense of cruelty, it was revenge in the sense of alignment, of closing the distance between what happened and what was recorded, of leaving no room for misinterpretation. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone still buzzing with unanswered calls and texts, I realized that the power I had been searching for was not in persuading them to see me differently, but in refusing to let them define what could or could not be said. I had stepped outside the script they wrote, and I was not going back inside. And while I knew there would be fallout, while I knew Jenna would scramble to rebuild the version of her life that always put me in the role of the supporting character, I also knew that for the first time I was not afraid of the cost. Because the truth had already been sent, and the truth did not need me to defend it anymore. By the time the day bled into evening and the ceremony turned into scattered dinners and after-parties, I understood that the real confrontation was not going to happen on any stage or through any carefully written post, but in the quiet spaces where excuses usually take root, and I felt ready in a way I had not felt ready before. Not because I wanted to fight, but because I was no longer afraid of silence after the truth has already been spoken. I gathered with the people who had filled the seats my parents left vacant, and in that small after-gathering at a friend's apartment we shared cheap food, tired laughter, and stories about the ways we had all managed to survive nights that should have broken us. And I realized that this was the closest thing to family I had felt in years, because there was no performance here, only presence. It was later, when the noise had softened and I was thinking about heading home, that I received a message from an unknown number telling me my parents were on their way and wanted to reset for appearances. As though reconciliation were something you could schedule like a dentist appointment, and sure enough they arrived a little after 9, dressed for company, rehearsed lines already on their lips, and asked if we could speak outside before I left. I stepped into the cool night air and listened as they delivered their version of a truce, insisting that the posts had gone too far and that while they loved me, I needed to understand how hard it is for them to balance everything, and that sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the child who has more visibility, because the whole family benefits when Jenna succeeds. I let them finish without interruption, because I had spent too many years giving them opportunities to revise the script mid-scene, and when they finally looked at me, expectantly, waiting for me to smooth the rough edges like I always had, I told them calmly that I was finished performing for photos and that if they wanted a relationship with me it had to exist when there were no cameras, no brunch tables, no curated captions, only the reality of who shows up when it matters. They accused me of being cruel, of disrespecting years of sacrifice, of putting outsiders ahead of blood, and I answered with the only truth that mattered, which was that I was being specific, not cruel. And that clarity feels like cruelty only to people who have grown used to me swallowing the details so they would not have to taste them. My father muttered something about this phase passing, my mother shook her head, and I stepped back inside without waiting for agreement, because this conversation was not about winning or losing, but about no longer being drafted into a game I never agreed to play. The next morning, while the noise still lingered online and family threads pulsed with the awkwardness of too many people pretending not to take sides, I received an email from the foundation that had helped sponsor my program asking me to record a short clip for their page, a thank you to future students and a few words about what the journey meant. I sat at my desk with the camera balanced on a stack of books and spoke plainly about persistence, about the hours no one sees, about naming what hurts instead of burying it, and I ended with the same sentence I had said on stage, that this achievement was for those who never thought I could do it. I uploaded the clip, sent it to the coordinator, and thought little of it until that evening when it began to circulate, shared by colleagues, neighbors, and even a few local pages that saw something in it worth amplifying. For once the narrative did not belong to Jenna's curated feed or my parents' carefully edited updates, it belonged to me. And it required no defense. That night, while I was cleaning up dishes, I saw a notification that Jenna had sent me a message, not one of her usual bursts of accusation, but a simple line saying she was in her car and could not stop crying. She admitted she had not thought it mattered, that she believed I would always keep forgiving, always keep making space for her to shine, and now she was afraid she had lost me. I stared at the screen for a long moment, knowing that the old version of me would have rushed to comfort her, to reassure her that everything could be patched together if we just kept quiet about the hard parts, but I was not that person anymore. I replied with a single link to the clip that was already spreading beyond our circles, and I wrote, "Watch it. Then call me when you want to do this for real." I set the phone down without waiting for the 3 little dots that might or might not appear, because the choice was not mine anymore, and that realization felt like the first deep breath I had taken in years. For the first time, I went to sleep knowing that my story was not trapped in anyone else's timeline, not confined to their captions or their excuses, but living in my own words and my own decisions, and whether they ever chose to hear me or not. I had already spoken loudly enough for myself.